Hi everyone, thank you for joining. And just to let you know, this webinar is recorded, so just so you're aware. I'm Niamh, I'm a new agricultural consultant in SAC, and we're excited to talk with you about utilising winter forage and integrating livestock to arable farms. So for this webinar, we have three lovely speakers that will be so first off, we'll have Robin Walker, who will be talking about the trials that are being covered by SRUC as part of so this whole webinar is part of the Mixed project, which is funded by Horizon, the Horizon 2020 programme. So first off, we have Robin, who will be covering those trials, and then next we have Kirsten Williams, who will be coming and telling us about the livestock outlook of it. And then finally, we'll have Scott Campbell, who will give us the farmer's perspective on it and what he makes of it so far as someone who's newly trying it out. So to kick us off now, we'll have Robin.
Okay, thanks very much, Niamh. I'll just share my screen. So hopefully you can see that. Yeah, okay, excellent. So yeah, so thanks very much for introducing that. So really, this is really a follow-up to some of the information that we've gathered over the last couple of years, particularly based around Scotland in our terms, but there's other groups who are looking at various things in the Mixed project in about another 10 different countries. But in terms of this particular piece of work, it's focusing on grazing of winter cereal crops with sheep. So I'll go into a little bit of the background as to why we're doing that for those of you who maybe aren't aware of the project at the moment. So one of the premises about this was hypothesis of grazing of winter cereals. Can it provide a valuable late winter feed source for ruminants, as well as maintaining acceptable grain and straw yields, and also maintaining soil as health, so we don't want to damage the soil. And this is really based around extreme weather events and occurrences which is associated lack of forage and fodder. So if I could go on to the next slide. We've had some quite extreme weather events over the last 10, 15 years, but these are just a few examples from recent times. So in 2018, we had a very dry summer, and the picture on the bottom left of the screen there kind of shows that, and the lack of forage there because of the very dry weather. And then in 2020, we had a really wet autumn as well. So there's some flooding again from this picture taken from this area. And we've also had a long, cold spring, summer, and also dry summer last year. So we've had these kind of extreme weather events which have caused people to occasionally run out of fodder for livestock, and start thinking about, well, what else can I feed my sheep in this instance of this particular project on, but what can we feed our ruminants on in particular? So we looked at so they looked at basically what was growing, what was accessible, and quite often there was a winter cereal in the ground, and they basically had to go at grazing that out of necessity more than anything else. So this particular slide here just kind of shows, I mentioned briefly about some of those extreme weather events. This is just rainfall data from the last few years. So anything that's kind of brown or the dark brown is something where the rainfall was particularly below average, and if it was a blue or darker blue, it was above average. So you can see 2018 and 2022 were really very dry years. This is average across the whole year, so it doesn't actually account for any particular deluges or very dry spells. It's across the whole, it's an average across the whole year, but it'll give you a feel for that. And 2020 was obviously quite a wet year, and 2021 was probably somewhere in the middle. But as I say, you're getting these extreme weather events where you maybe get a week of really heavy rain and then a dry spell and what have you. So it's really trying to overcome some of these sorts of issues that are occurring. So we're interested in winter cereals as a potential fodder crop. So what we wanted to know, people know, look at a grass field and they've got play meters and things like that, and they get a pretty good idea of how much dry matter there is in that particular field, and they can estimate that. What we didn't really know with the row crops as well, if how much biomass is there, how much dry matter is there, so how many kind of sheep could you graze for how long, that kind of thing. So what we actually started doing in 2021, and we followed that up in 2021-22, and we're doing it again this year, is getting quadrat samples at various points through the season, so between every 2-3 weeks, from November through to sort of April time. Getting, you see on the bottom right hand side of the picture there, we've got quadrats, so we're cutting the biomass back, getting the dry matter, and then we're testing it for feed quality at each time point. So we've got an indication for winter wheat and winter barley over those periods of time. And we're putting that together, or at least Niamh's putting that together as part of basically a guide, really, that people maybe can use as a visual guide to see what they've actually likely to have in their field at any one time, if they're thinking of grazing their crops at that point. So these took place at Kirkton at SRUC's campus near Aberdeen. This set of data here is from the 2020-21. So this is just the biomass. So it stunted a little bit over the middle of the winter period with the cold weather, and then it took off again in the spring, and the winter wheat on this side. But what we're particularly interested in, we've got the dates here. So this is kind of mid-November, traveling through to May in this instance for both sets. But the crude protein for the winter barley started off quite good. This was done using a hay analysis actually at the labs. So we're looking quite high, sort of 30-ish, high 20%, and it tails off as you get into kind of late spring. We're also interested in the D values as well. So they were in the sort of high 80s and 90s. So again, pretty good. And the hay ME was also pretty good, around about sort of 14, and it was much the same for the wheat as well, actually, getting around about sort of high 20s crude protein content. D values again in really good, high 80s, 90s, and again the hay ME was also really good, around about sort of 14 or something like that. Protein tended to kind of last a wee bit longer over that period of time for the wheat. It stayed higher for longer than it did for the winter barley, but overall it was looking, at least in terms of lab analysis, like it was pretty good forage that we were producing. This is from the previous winter, so previous winter to now anyway, so the 2021-22 season. This is just for winter wheat. Slightly different way of looking at this, but we've got the dates across the top. So this was kind of mid-November, heading across roughly every sort of 3 or 4 weeks through to mid-March. The crops that we grazed in our trials were actually towards around about this period, so it's kind of end of February, early March time. So that's kind of what we were expecting. But in terms of the winter wheat for this year, so the follow-up year, the results were much the same. We're getting proteins in the sort of like high 20, sort of 30%. D values again, sort of high 80s, sort of around about 90% as well. And the hay ME was around about sort of 13, 14. So again, pretty happy with that. And this figure at the bottom here just gives you a rough indication of the dry matter that was produced at those periods in time. And these crops were just field crops at the Kirkton campus, were managed by the farm, typically sort of sown at sort of typical times of year and harvested at typical times of year, and the inputs were fairly typical for a conventional crop. So it's fairly sort of basic bog standard stuff. We just superimposed these quadrats on that. And we also superimposed these plots. So we had grazing experiments on these fields, same fields where the quadrats were taken. This just shows the winter barley crop that we had in the 2021 season. And you can see on the left here, various plots are out here. So this kind of green one here was an ungrazed plot. This one here had been grazed for 1 day and the others had all been grazed for 2 days. So these sheep would come off the next day. So you can see it was grazed really quite hard. And we were really quite worried because originally we were going to have sheep grazing up to 3 days. So essentially kind of mob grazed for 3 days. But after 2 days, we had this and we took them off early because we thought we were a little bit concerned. As it happened, literally, this is probably end of June, early July time, we couldn't see any difference, you know, between what had been here beforehand, and actually that kind of followed through into the following year. This is just showing the same site. This time it was winter wheat. It's just looking the other way, but again you can see there's no grazing in this one. You can see these were grazed for this was grazed for 1 day and these two were grazed for 2 days, but we stuck at that point in time to the same grazing regime that we had in our first experiment. These plots were superimposed onto where they had been the previous year. We actually had an adjacent trial, exactly the same design, just down the hill next to it. So we ended up with 2 trials in this particular field. So one had the grazing regime over a 2-year period, and another one was a grazing regime over the first period. And actually currently we've got a 3rd year on this site and a 2nd year on the site just adjacent to it as well. But again, you can see where the crops have been grazed. Literally within a month or 2, you started to not really be able to see much of a difference. And again, that followed through into later in the year as well. It was that, you know, if you're walking through that field, you wouldn't have known that the crops have been grazed particularly. So what did it tell us? We did various assessments during the season. One of the things we're interested in was tillering. We're interested to see whether there's an impact on disease. So, you know, if any disease material had been eaten by the sheep, would that mean there'd be less spread, less of an issue of the disease later on? We're interested in weed pressure. We're interested in whether the crop was ripening sooner or later. We're interested in plant height as well, because there was potential to maybe not have a growth regulator on. And likewise with the disease as well. We've not tried it in these trials, but if people are interested in whether they can maybe reduce, you know, not having maybe a T0 or a T1 fungicide spray. So there's interest in that in terms of reducing inputs. We looked at grains per head and grain quality, and again, there was no real influence whether they're grazed or whether it was 1 or 2 days or the 0 grazing had any real difference on there. We've got some data which we're processing at the moment in terms of root biomass, which is quite a long, laborious process, but we're piecing that together at the moment. So I hope we'll have something on that. And we've also done measurements of the VES soil health card here, which is basically about soil structure and sort of simple method of soil health. We've done that, and worm counts as well. And again, we didn't really see any difference in the crops, and that actually was the same for both years, 2001 harvest and 2022 harvest as well. Similarly, when it came to the harvest, so we used plot combines to harvest the crops in 2021 and 2022 harvest time, and given the visual differences that we saw when the sheep were actually grazing, I say it was a big surprise the first year. It definitely was a big surprise that there were no real differences in terms of either grain yield or straw yield between the different graze treatments. By the 2nd year, it was maybe less of a surprise because we half expected it, but again, we didn't really see any big differences. The only differences that we did see was between years. So I remember I said we had the trial was the same design was superimposed onto the original trial. So the original trial had a slightly lower yield average than the new trial on the kind of the fresh ground next to it. But within those, the individual treatments weren't any different, and we suspect this was slightly lower, probably just because of the you know, the activity of the machinery, etc. on there. So maybe it was a tad more compaction or something on there. But within the year, there was no difference between the actual grazing treatments themselves. This is the current experiment. So these sheep were in the field last week. In this instance, we had, well, each plot is 15 meters by 11 meters. So we have 2 sheep per plot, and that equates to roughly 120 sheep per hectare. So maximum they were in there was for 3 days. These are basically some pictures I took at the end of last week, literally just after the sheep had come off. So this was 0 grazed ground. This was ground that had been grazed for 1 day. This was ground that had been grazed for 2 days. And this was ground that had been grazed for 3 days. So compared to some of the earlier pictures that I showed, we probably had the potential to either add an extra sheep. So we only had 2 sheep there, and that was partly because of what we had available for us to use, or we could have increased the the length that they were grazing for, but we didn't, because we'd the experiments and the treatments that we'd used last time, we wanted to kind of stick fairly closely to that rather than have an extensive period. So there was potential to probably have another day, possibly even 2 days grazing on these with the same number of sheep, or add another sheep. So that's what it kind of looked like in the field. Moving on to the network farm. So we have a number of farmers who have been trialing this. Some have been doing it for a number of years, and some are just starting, and Scott's going to have a chat about his experience shortly. But obviously there's an interest in financial return from the grazing itself, but also the potential to reduce input costs. So again, we've gone out to different farms and we've got some data from the crop and some soil data as well. So what we had last year, so 2022, it was quite similar to what we had in terms of the 2021 results. In this instance, this last year's harvest, we're basically focusing on split fields. So either field that had half had been fenced off and was grazed, and the other half was ungrazed. So there were 2 winter wheat fields and 2 winter oat fields that we kind of focused on with the particular farm in this instance. And again, similar to what we found in our small plot trials, no real big influence in terms of tillering between the grazed or ungrazed. Disease-wise as well, no big difference there, although these did all have fungicide on them, so that probably masked any potential differences that you may have seen. But in this instance, there was no real difference in terms of disease or weed pressure for that matter. Key development stages as well. The crops that had been grazed tended to catch up, and likewise plant height. You got the odd difference, but it sometimes it was a graze one that was a bit better, sometimes a young graze. So there was no real difference there. Only thing we really found that was a slight difference was grains per head. So there's a slight tendency for grazing to perhaps increase the number of grains per head, but that was the only real thing that we found. There was a big difference there. Something else that we looked at as well. So been primarily talking about grazed winter cereals. One of the farms actually had a cover crop which they grazed. So they actually had a split treatment split into 3, the field. So they'd flailed part of the green manure, they'd grazed part of the green manure, or they had an ungrazed area. So this is an overwintered green manure. So they had sheep on it at the winter period and took that through to the autumn, and then they actually sowed a winter wheat crop. So we went in to the winter wheat crop and did some assessments on that, just to see what the grazing effect had been on the previous, on the cover crop. There were really no very clear differences in all of these different things, the tillering disease, etc. But we also did some root biomass data of these. And I'll come on to that. We're doing some more on some of the actual cereals themselves that are in the ground. In the ground last year at heading. That's where you tend to kind of get the maximum root biomass. So that's when we did some of these cores. But I'll just come on to the next slide, which is talking about the root biomass at different depths of the winter wheat that had followed on from the cover crop. So here we've got a different depth. So we split them into, the core was 3.5 centimeters diameter. We went down 0 to 10, 10 to 20 centimeters, 20 to 30 centimeters, 34 30 to 40 centimetres. And then we've got the different treatments here. We've got flailed, this is milligrams of root biomass, grazed or the ungrazed. And you can see here the ungrazed had the least biomass of the 3 different treatments. As you'd expect, the top of the soil profile, you tended to get more root biomass, and it tailed off as you kind of moved down. The flailed was generally the next best, and the grazed seemed to have the greatest amount of biomass, certainly in the upper layers. So it did seem to have some impact in terms of root biomass, which I guess if you're talking about maybe drier periods and trying to kind of overcome that, that could be actually a beneficial thing. But we've got more data to come on that. It's quite a long, intensive process, kind of washing loads of different roots out and weighing them all. So we've got more to come there. We've only got a partial data set at this point in time. Anyway, our network is increasing. So there's a few more farmers who come on board, particularly since December last year, actually. And again, we're focusing on split fields because we want that comparison of the grazed versus the ungrazed. This is a farm nearby, just north of Aberdeen. And this was a farm that was particularly forward in terms of a winter oat crop. It looks really bad here because this was taken just after it had snowed quite heavily and melted, so it kind of got squashed flat. But again, we were getting biomass of the crop, and then the farmer got sheep in from a neighbour, I think it was. So you can see the fence line. So this side here has been grazed a little bit, and this bit hasn't. And you can see here, this was a bit later on in the year, about a month later. You can see the grazed area at the back of this particular picture, and in the foreground it's the same material here. So we'll get a comparison of the 2 parts as we go on through the season, and we'll just assess some of the things that I've spoken about beforehand. This is also from some of the farms recently. So we've spoken about winter wheat. This is from a different farm again, but it's showing fairly similar sort of forage quality, feed quality for the winter wheat as we'd got in the other one. So again, there was no kind of standout. You know, we're fairly confident that the results that we've been getting are at least consistent with the different crops. And then just for something slightly different, we've got winter oat data as well. So slightly less crude protein and slightly lower D values, etc., and a slightly lower HME, but still not bad. And then there's another farm is actually looking at grazing winter oilseed rape as well, and there's some values there related to the feed quality. And these samples were taken at or around the time that the sheep were going into, so we've got a comparison of what they're actually eating at the time. So take-home messages. Winter cereals do seem to be pretty resilient to grazing and do recover well, or seem to recover quite well. So far, we've not really found any, well, say little impact on yield, no real negative impact on yield or the other agronomic or crop quality side of things. And the soil factors as well, we've not really found any major negatives. In fact, arguably there's a slight positive there in terms of the potential improved rooting. I say mob grazing, you know, we had a short period of time for our small plot experiments. That seemed to work quite well. You know, we've had 2 years where we've had consistent results, and we've got another year's results, or we'll have another year's results at the end of this year, or more extensively grazed. So most of the farmers in the network generally have a bigger area with fewer sheep, and they're basically grazing for a longer period of time. So normally it's a minimum of 2 weeks, and it could be up to 6 weeks, 2 months even, basically because they don't want to mess around with moving electric fencing all the time. So get the sheep in and tend to leave them. Also, some of the farmers who've been doing this for a while are sowing really quite early and then grazing pre-Christmas. And others, more like the ones that we had at Kirkton, would be using a more typical kind of sowing date and maybe grazing up into March, something like that. But all of them so far seem to be working equally well. We've not had anybody who's kind of said there's they've had a major issue. This potential to check forward crops. It was a mild winter. This is the oat field I spoke about before. that was very forward, probably because of the mild winter. We'll see how this one goes, because it was certainly the most forward crop that I'd seen. So hopefully it's fine. And also in terms of, at least in terms of lab analysis, the feed value does seem to be pretty good. And in some of the network farmers, the graziers are actually asking them, you know, can we get the sheep on, because it's looking like it could be good feed. Just a very quick summary. We've had a number of knowledge exchange activities, such as this webinar, for farmers, students, research and advisors, certainly to go and see the trials. Basically explaining what we're doing and the results about the network. We've either just, other events have just taken place or planned over the remainder of the project. So we've just had a French farmer group over who kind of joined forces for the day last Friday with the arable network that the SAC at Thainston run in Aberdeen. So that was great that they sort of got together and had a good old chat and discussing about all of these kind of things. As I said before, there's a couple of technical guides in preparation, one more arable focused and one sort of grazier focused. And it ties in again with some of the information I said about the kind of the visual guide and the quality, the dry matter and feed quality as well. And there'll be more information as well on social media accounts, etc. And this is just a picture from last Friday. So this is the French guys up at Ashtown, at Kirkton, talking about the trials there. This is one of the fields at Tulloch Farms near Lawrencekirk. So this is the grazed area of winter oats in this instance, and on the right hand side is the ungrazed area. The sheep came off here, I think a couple of days before, and the sheep that had been on here then moved on to this crop here. So this is what they're feeding on at the moment. And then this is just the groups and various discussion as well. So thank you very much for a whole range of people who are involved in this, and thanks for your attention so far, and to the funders. And then this is all the various people who are involved in the mixed project as well. So thank you very much.
Perfect. So thank you, Robin, for that. So it's Kirsten who's going to present next. I put a little comment into the chat bar. If there's anyone that has any questions, do put them into the question and answer section, and I'll read them out at the end, and then you can have all your answers at the once everyone's presented. Thank you.
Thanks, Niamh. Can you see my screen okay? Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to speak more on the sheep side. So I'm a sheep and beef consultant, so not so hot on the arable and better on the livestock. So it's just from a different perspective that I'm going to speak about this afternoon. So I guess there's a lot of people ask why do it. So it's our grandfathers probably did it quite frequently, and quite often it was called the golden hoof, the animals on the arable crop, or the muck spreaders walking over the arable crop. And it's kind of gone out of fashion a bit with fungicides, plant growth regulators and the likes coming onto the market, and at a point not being too expensive as well, and a lot easier used. So it has kind of gone out of fashion, and now there's a lot of talk of regenerative agriculture. There's input prices going up, and it's kind of coming back in where people are looking to graze crops with livestock again. And it offers so many benefits, and Robin's spoken about some of the benefits, but here's just a mind splat of some of the benefits. If we look at the soil, we're thinking about there's organic matter getting back into the soil. So there's a lot of arable farms that just won't have had livestock manures for several years. So it's a great way to get some organic matter, some more nutrients back in there. But it's also allowing a cover over the winter. So say it's either grazing arable crops, or it might be like a cover crop like Robin spoke about, and it's just a way to make sure that there's not that bare soil for the winter, so we're protecting our soil asset a bit better. There's also benefits to the crop, which Robin has spoken about there as well, but one I think that which is really nice there is weed control. So these four-legged manure spreaders and weed wipers. They're really sorting out everything. Well, it's not a cost. It doesn't require fuel, and it doesn't require inputs. They actually, when they graze the crop, they're really selective grazers, so they'll never just stick to one part of a field. They'll move quite a lot within a day, which means that they actually graze it all down to the same level. It's not just one part of the crop's the sweet part, so they just graze that. So think of a park that's been cut for silage or something, a grass park, and it's all taken down to the one kind of length, and then it all grows back bonny at the same time. And that's pretty much what the sheep are doing as well. So they're grazing down all that biomass, and then it'll come up and till it up quite nicely together, and nice and uniform as well. With that kind of grazing, and as they go across the whole field, they're going to kind of remove any diseased or dead material as well. So it just lets all that nice new growth come through as well. Going back to the weed control, if you've got any volunteers coming up in a crop at all, they're really good at grazing those out. And this picture here is actually showing a crop of winter wheat. The previous crop to this was beans, and you can see the beans. There's a nice line of beans here. Actually, you see it a bit darker in the crop there. And the aim of the sheep here is that they'll take out those volunteer beans, but they're also going to graze right down so that they've taken off all of the leaf of the crop. So then it'll come back with this, the biomass will be stripped out and it'll come back nice. On the right of the wire here hasn't been grazed. To the left, the sheep were in there for about 2 or 3 days. And the aim is that they won't come out of this field until all the leaf has been eaten. So when Robin was showing some slides at the end there of a black park, that's the aim here, not to make it as black as possible, but just to remove that leaf to then let it come up nice. So I think this shows it quite nicely where you've got those volunteers. Next, you'll have a kind of black park, and then those volunteers don't come back. So it's really eradicating the need to get rid of those volunteers, but it's also hopefully eradicating the requirement for a T-Nort spray as well, because you've removed all that dead and kind of disease material, and then it'll come up as new growth there. So what to graze it with, when to graze it with. There's actually some people that have grazed cattle and crops. I prefer sheep because sheep they're lighter on the land, they have less impact on the land, and their hoof is that much smaller as well. So they're not going to make a mess of your crop. So sheep work really nicely. It can be lambs, it can be ewes. You've seen the nutrition that's within that crop. So for growing lambs, it's really nice. It's pretty much like a finishing ration for them. So if you've got some store lambs to finish, then it works well for them as well. Works really well in your forward crops. We saw that picture of the oat crop in Aberdeenshire, and it works really nice with just chewing down that biomass. Any crops that are sown early, any crops that have had muck, anything that you think is just going to bolt, then it's a really nice crop for that. And ideally, we want to be grazing it in the tillering stage. So between the kind of growth stage 21 to 29, and before you get to your growth stage 30s, when you start to have your nodes and your growing points. So that's the kind of aim of when to actually graze it. Now, the main challenges that we come across are people say, oh, great idea, I'm into that, but I've taken out all my fences, there's no dikes left, and there is a lot of arable farms that just don't have any fences at all. Fencing, water, how much time is it going to take? My park's too big. It's all of the kind of usual things that we hear, but there is loads of solutions out there as well. Electric fencing is easy got now, and once you invest in it, you've got it. There's some great ways, and you see like an unwinder in the picture in the bottom right there that just works off of the back wheel of the quad, and it'll unwind it, so it can be done quite quickly. We've got solar powered batteries, which really eliminates having to take batteries away and charge them if they break out. So there's some nice kind of solutions there as well. I think another great solution is to collaborate, and you don't have to own the sheep or deal with the sheep or know anything about sheep to do it. quite often your shepherd or your sheep worker isn't going to be very good at arable crop growing, and your arable farmer probably isn't very good at knowing how to deal with sheep. So it's using those two kind of expertise to their best, and just working out an agreement that actually works for both sides. That, right, you're the expert at the crops, you know how far down you want it, you know which crops are the forward crops, but I know about sheep and their health and their welfare and what they need and when they need shifted. So it can work really, really nicely in collaboration with a sheep farmer. The other thing to think about is a plan B, and this goes back to, I guess, Robin's initial slides where he was looking at the weather patterns, and we have really, really wet weather, we can have snow, and it's having that plan B that what if the weather does go wrong? Where are they going to go? Because there's not a lot of arable fields actually have shelter, and it's thinking, what can I do that if the weather does turn, where can they go? So is it that there's some green cover that they can go on so they don't poach the crop? It's a really, really good idea to have enough fencing kit that you've actually got the next field set up, maybe even the next 2 or 3 fields set up, so that if the weather does turn, say it goes really wet, that you can move them on faster and move them, be it per paddock or in the field as well. Also then, if there's, say, a problem with labour or you can't get somebody to set up the next fence, you've kind of got a backup there as well because your next fence is already set up. So there's just a few kind of challenges that we hear, and I think whenever there's a challenge, there's always an opportunity, and it's thinking, right, if my challenge is I don't have the time, I don't have the sheep, right, can I go and collaborate with somebody? And that collaboration might involve them supplying the fence, you might supply the fencing yourselves, and every agreement is completely different. It's just what works for you and your farm. So from the sheep farmer point of view, this is where I'm more comfortable speaking about with the sheep. There's loads and loads of benefits here. And if we look at the diagram on the right-hand side, you see kind of in the green, that is feed supply, and in the red line, that's feed demand. So you see quite clearly when supply exceeds demand. As grass is growing through the spring and summer, we usually have too much, so that's why we cut silage. And then as we get into winter, we never have enough forage. And it's always that problem for sheep farmers is trying to fill that forage gap. So it may be that it's root crops, brassicas, but another way is off-wintering the sheep. And to be able to off-winter them on an arable crop actually offers the sheep farmer some really clean grazing. You're not going to have a worm problem on crop. You're not going to have a feet problem on crop. You're not going to have scab in the fence posts on crop. So it's offering really good benefits from an animal health point of view. It's also given the sheep farmer that bit more land that they can expand. So they could possibly carry more sheep in the summer, but the winter is the real kind of block because they don't have the forage. But if they know they've got this extra bulk of forage in the winter, it may let them expand as well. We've seen the nutrition, it's an excellent nutrition that it offers, and it offers great opportunities for the next generation. So for new entrants, the biggest stumbling point is usually a lack of being able to access land. And if arable farmers have a vast amount of land on crop and it's forward, it offers benefits to them. What a great way to bring in the next generation. Quite often, new entrants go into sheep first because it's lower capital. You get a quicker return on your investment, and that your lamb sales are quicker than cattle sales. So it works really nicely that could potentially be helping the next generation of for the agricultural industry coming in and giving them experience, but also learning off of the farmer at the same time. So there's loads and loads of benefits for the sheep farmer as well as the arable farmer. And everybody sets it up different. How it works on your farm is got to be where you go. And communication is absolutely key. As long as the two parties talk and know what you want to achieve out of it. And here's just kind of three different types of agreements that various people do. First one there is a arable farmer buys the electric fencing, the troughs, the pipes, puts out that investment of a couple of £1,000. They've got it there, and they kind of keep control of when those sheep move. If they've got labour through the winter, it's a great way to use labour for setting up the fences, and they very much have control of this is when the sheep will move. The downside, I guess, is quite often arable farmers don't have dogs that want to work with sheep, and you don't want to take track quads and such like onto your crop. But it can work then if you've got good communication with the person who owns the sheep, then they can come and they can move with the dogs. They can also check on their health and welfare as well. That then allows the arable farmer the ability to charge a bit more per head per week, because they're obviously putting their labour into setting up the fences. The other way would be that the sheep owner, the new entrant, whoever it is, they own the electric fencing, so they wouldn't pay as much on a per head per week basis. And again, then it's just understanding when the farmer wants to move them. You can actually get quite a good rate per head per week on it, because you can graze quite a lot of sheep on them. So ideally, you're wanting to give it a quick hit. You're wanting to get that biomass down. So we're looking at about 200 sheep per hectare. And depending on the biomass of the crop, they might be in there for a couple of days, or they might be there for a couple of weeks. But if you've got a large arable area, you can actually hold quite a lot of sheep within that winter period. And depending on how forward a winter it is and everything else, depends obviously on that biomass of the crop. So there's various ways that it can be done in collaboration with other people. And here's just a couple of take-home messages, I guess, from the sheep side, is it's trying to capitalise on both the arable expertise, the sheep expertise, to then benefit both of them mutualistically. Always having a plan B, and it is really important if the weather changes that there is shelter or there's other forage for the sheep to eat. It is such a good way for new entrants to get access into the industry. I think it could be a really, really good method to try and enhance and increase the amount of people who get started in agriculture. And I guess the last one is just making sure that everybody communicates, and that way you know that everybody's getting something from the agreement, that everybody's happy, and then hopefully it's an agreement that lasts the test of time. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Kirsten. Perfect. So next up is Scott. He's going to give us his perspective as a new person doing this on his farm. Scott is an arable farmer, and he has a grazier coming on with sheep onto his.
Hello, can everyone hear me there?
We can, yes.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Perfect. Hi everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak this afternoon for somebody that knows nothing about sheep, but I do know a bit about growing wheat, but I've never done anything quite like this, a trial over the winter time, so it has been really quite interesting. So I'll just move on and give a quick overview of our business. So we're based beside Blackburn, Aberdeenshire, a family business, 400 hectare of arable. We've also got an excavation business and do a lot of diversification and help out at college with the students. There's 3 partners, my dad, my uncle and myself, and I've got 1 full-time employee. And there's nobody getting any younger, and we're trying to work a bit smarter and not harder and not overcomplicate things, but sometimes it doesn't work out that way. So moving on to this trial, when the field was actually sown, we didn't actually know it was going to be grazed, and we do have opportunity for early drilling because there's 4 of us at harvest. We don't do the excavation at harvest, we concentrate on harvest because it's like the main income for the business. So we do have opportunity to drill wheat earlier than what we actually do. So the bit of details about the field that was grazed, it's 9.5 hectares, and we split the field in half in the middle of a tram line of the sprayer boom, so we could measure everything up. And we split the field into 3 sections, top, middle and bottom, just for monitoring it for a start, because we didn't know much about it. And the soil type, it's sandy loam soil, and the pH is about 6.2. The phosphate and the potash is kind of moderate to high. And the college, I think it was Robin, did a lot of testing before the sheep went on. So we do 2 cultivation types on the farm. We do the traditional ploughing and sowing with the trail drill now. And the other method is Tirano cultivation, followed by the horse pronto, kind of a min-till system. So this field was min-tilled, and it's I think it's quite going to work out quite well, the min-till for the grazing, because it's not so spongy and it won't get boggy and poached quite so much. So we've viewed 2 fields, and we thought the min-till one was definitely going to be better. So the cultivation date was the 1st of September, and the drilling date was the 12th, which is still quite early because it's Skyscraper, the variety that's in. We're tending to move away from that next year, but it is a dirtier variety, which will make this trial more interesting with the disease as well. Sowing depth, it was a brand new Vadastrad demo drill that planted this field. It was 4.5 centimetres. I thought if I was grazing, I would make sure and drill the wheat quite deep in case this does get wet in the sheep's field. Pete did pick it out. And I said the variety was Skyscraper. We always combined drill. There was 220 kilos a hectare of 0.3514 put in. And then our normal fertilizer policy is potash in the spring, and then 2 to 3 goes of liquid N up to about 210 kilos a hectare. This year it could be different on this field because of the sheep and also the break-even ratio between the price of grain and the price of fertilizer. Rotation of the field in 2019 was green manure for the eaks, oil radish and vetch and phacelia. And 2020 we took a big crop of Skyscraper winter wheat off it. 21 I think it was Diablo spring barley, 22 oilseed rape, and then back to winter wheat. And the organic matter using loss of ignitions about 7 to 8% and slowly rising. And the field has had a go of farmyard manure and a go of digestate, 1 go each over the last 5 years, plus the green manure and 1 back end cover crop to raise the organic matter. So I've just got a video here showing you the field when it was drilled. Just a traditional trail Vadastrad drill. This is the actual field getting drilled. That's just the top headland. And on my next photograph, I think I've got the field on the 25th of November, just before the grazing started. The growth stage was 2 to 3 leaves, and the wheat was tested by the college before they went on. So that's the electric fence was up, and it was a great November. And when we put the sheep on, the weather did turn, and I thought it was going to poach the field quite bad, but it turned out to actually be not too bad. So as Kirsten said, there was one good thing about doing this trial. There was very little capital investment for ourselves, or next to nothing. Scott Day, I know him from Young Farmers. He was really attentive, good shepherd. He came out and fenced it, and all I did was take down some water for the sheep. And at that time the weather did break a bit, that flooding, and then we got the snow and frost in December, so we didn't get off to the easiest start, which was probably good. We did put the field into 3 sections so we can monitor what we're going to do next time if there is snow and frost, because there hasn't been a lot of snow or frost in December in the last 5 years with people doing this. It's normally come in February or March, the bad weather. And the right hand photo there, that's the first trial. You can see it was grazing quite far down, and we had the farm advisory meeting around then when Ian Wilson luckily came up. So here, when did we move the sheep on? Well, even baby Alien, she got a teapot for her Christmas, and the sheep didn't even want a cup of tea. They were quite happy grazing away. So I would have never have taken the wheat down so far as this if Ian Wilson didn't come up and speak and say, no, keep on going, just so you can see the rows and no more. So we went for that, and then we just moved them on to the next section. There was only 30 lambs per section. And if you look on the left-hand photo, this is the middle section here. You could just see the rows and no more. And the right-hand photo, that's the lambs onto the top section, with the bottom and the middle really quite bare. The challenge we had was when they were on the bottom section, there was snow and frost. As I said, we didn't really know when to move them off. So we'd put in 2 bales of hay at the bottom corner, just for a bit of shelter and to give them a bit of cover. And luckily the snow did come away, and then when they did get onto the middle section, they really did graze it quite fast, because they must have been needing something by then. But they all kept healthy enough throughout the trial. And stocking rate was 30 lambs, and it took 45 days to graze the 4.5 hectare. And that was starting on the 1st of December and finishing on the 15th of January. As I said, with the challenge of the snow and ice, and we added some hay, we couldn't see the wheat, how far down it was. On a commercial scale, this could be a challenge if you had a 40-acre field, but as Kirsten says, you would need a bit next door to move them on, or if there was snow for weeks, you would maybe just need to take them off if the weather got really bad. And recovery 1 month on, this is the middle section, and I was told that the bottom section, for example, will be recovering before the middle, and the middle will obviously recover before the top, and that's absolutely right. It's quite amazing how it is recovering. And that's the 2 photos, one of me kneeling down, and the second one, you can see all the rows fine now. And to be honest, if the whole field was grazed and someone came in about and you said you sow it in the end of October, they would never question you or never know. It's quite amazing how it is recovering, which given us a lot of peace of mind going forward and for repeating the trial again, especially with the wet weather at the bottom bit's not so far on as recovering as the middle, but it's getting there. And from the drone photo that was taken at the weekend, you can see the middle section is recovering the fastest, because the bottom was maybe grazed a little bit harder with the wet weather, and the top, it's coming back now as well. From a drone photo, everything normally looks quite blanky, so I think that's a really good recovery already. And I had a look again today, and it's even grown back again. So where now with the trial, obviously we've done it on a tramline basis, and I'm going to miss a tramline of T0 fungicide on the grazed and ungrazed, and we'll have a look at the disease. And I'll still give it all its, manganese and copper and stuff the same, but I'll just miss out the fungicide. And then I'm planning on keeping the growth regulators the same, but skyscraper normally needs something that kind of flag leaf to keep it back. If it is short at that time, potentially save a bit of that, but I don't know as yet. It'll need to be viewed. And we've moved the sheep on to a 6-acre bit of oats, doing 2 tram lines of winter oats. Hopefully they'll be off in March. And we're already planning for next year, looking in at buying overwintered seed, because if we're going to be drilling early, one thing we're going to need the seed, and secondly we need to check with Scott how much he's going to be able to graze next year. Worst case would be we put in 100 acres and sow it in the middle of August, and then Scott says, oh no, I've only got sheep for 50 acre. We could have 50 acre going flat and getting more disease. So as Kirsten rightly says, it's about communication and knowing what you're doing. Personally, I wouldn't split the field into 3 sections again. I might do a few half fields next year, but for time and labour and, you know, everyone's busier, I would do it more on a commercial scale. But for data, I would still do a few half fields, and that would be less time for Scott to move his sheep, etc. And costs for other, I know we get rent for sheep. I'm not taking rent for this because it is a trial, and it's really good to gather data from both sides, from a sheep farmer and an arable farmer. Been enjoyed doing this trial over the winter. And I did some rough costings. As I say, this field, I think it was at 200 kilos a hectare we normally drill at an average. Okay, sometimes you could get down to 180, 190, but if we got going the 20th of August, which we could do, no problem, and go down to 120 kilos a hectare of seed, if seed's £600 a tonne, which it could still easily be, I don't know, that would say about 50 hectares on seed. And then a T0 for skyscraper, potentially save another £20 a hectare. If we're moving on to a cleaner variety, that might not be so much as that, but with everything rising in cost, it probably will be. So that's £70 a hectare of potential savings, plus you get your rent for your sheep, plus we get drilling earlier and should get better root establishment and more chance of drilling in better conditions as well. We've got labour to drill, because normally my uncles need to get drilling as soon as, and I'm kind of like, well, we can't get going because it's going to be too early and we're going to have to do another fungicide or up that. But there is a big potential to get drilling early and get on with the workload and save on seed. And as I say, it's been a good fun trial and great to work with other people over the winter. And, you know, the whole thing about lone working, and it's great to have data from both sides and work with young farmers and Scott and the college on this trial. And the more sampling and stuff we do and work on it, I think there can only be one way and get benefits for everyone, really. And just like to thank you to all the SRUC staff and Farm Advisory Service for having a meeting at ourselves, Ian Wilson from Tulloch Farms for coming up and the visit there the other day. It was really good. He's definitely doing it on a big commercial scale and grazing it down, and I think it's just so great. He was actually laughing at one field he thought he'd ruined because he forgot to move them off, and then the wheat was growing back. So it's if it wasn't for Ian, we would never have grazed it as hard as that. So thank you to Ian and Julia for our drone photos. Thank you very much to Julia for doing that, and Scott Day to the shepherd for attention to detail, and great to work with him. And as Kirsten said, you know, you need to work well with each other. If they're not going to answer the phone or move them on, or they're busy doing something else, it's just not going to work. And we both agreed we really need to get off to a good start with this trial and pay attention, because if we didn't pay attention, it's not going to work going forward. But as I say, I can only see positives on it. And you know, are we grazing it too early to save disease? You know, that wheat's recovering well. Should we be grazing it just into March, taking them off and then get on the nitrogen? I don't know. But to get data from it, I had to go with the way we've done it. And also next year, we'll need to start a bit earlier. I was planning on not starting in October, but starting grazing in November to get going if we are going to do 70 to 100 acres, to see the other challenges. We're going to be taking the yield of this field as we potentially could be drilling. So we'll need to maybe drill a bit and then get the data from this field and then continue with the drilling. I don't want to put in 100 acres and it not be, we don't know what way the results are going, but I would say the way that wheat's recovering at the moment, I'm not concerned, and there can only be benefits. And that's about it from me, and thank you all for listening. And we'll share the harvest data with the SRUC, and I'm sure they will pass it on to anyone that's interested. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Scott. That was great. I suppose if you don't mind, I'll ask you the first question, and it's one for myself. Did you find that that just kind of getting that you were able to mix with a grazier during kind of like, I suppose during winter time when it's a bit more duller and everything like that, that there was kind of even a social benefit for yourself?
Yeah, no, there definitely was. Yeah, you know, there's quite a lot going on in our business as it is, but arable wise, everyone kind of switches off about their crops and doing other things. So no, but with Scott coming in about, and I had these meetings with other people, and we actually had two neighbours phoning, saying that there's sheep out in on your wheat. Do you know that they're there? And so no, it only brings a bit of laughter, and seeing other people going about is great. Yeah, definitely.
Fantastic. Thank you, Scott. So the first question is for yourself, Robin. I know Robin's been very good. He's been typing the answers as well, but I'm going to be really mean and make him read them out as well. So the first question was, hi, Robin, you say little impact on yield, but was there some actual impact on yield or delayed harvest, even if it was only 1 or 2 days?
Yeah, I mean, as I tapped in the box there, we didn't get any difference in our plot experiments in terms of the yield. Was very little between, you know, the different treatments, the 0 grazed or the 1 or the 2 day. It was really quite minimal in what we found anyway. And it could have been, you know, there could have been a day or so, but it was you know, it was really quite minor. And the other part was, yeah, and there was no obvious trend either, so it wasn't as if like there was a zero, you know, obviously you get differences, but it wasn't statistically different, but there was no real trend. So, you know, it wasn't as if like the ungraze was slightly lower than the 1 day and then the 2 day was the, you know, or the opposite way around. It was, you know, it wasn't quite often the 2 day was like the highest and then the others were either side, and it wasn't, you know, it wasn't a clear kind of trend there, but statistically there was no difference between them at all. But anecdotally, and some of the observations, I mean, Scott was just chatting about Ian Wilson, who came up to his farm for a meeting, and Scott was part of the group that went down and met up with the French people last week. Ian was kind of saying that actually what he finds is that once the crop's been grazed, it actually seems to almost get a bit of a boost and sort of forces its way through the growth stages a wee bit quicker. So it kind of said sometimes it actually is slightly earlier than the ungrazed part. But again, quite often it's very difficult to say because you're not always getting the same thing each time. You know, you maybe get something might be slightly forward or slightly back, but sometimes it switches from field to field. It's not always really obvious, and that's the same for a lot of the other measurements that we've taken as well. You know, occasionally you'll get a slight, you know, maybe slightly more tillering in the grazed versus the ungrazed, and actually sometimes it's the other way around in other fields as well. So there's no really clear trend across everything. It's, you know, they're all much the same or
Perfect. And the next question is a little bit more difficult, so anyone who wants to hop in on it is, do the panelists see any implications for the new post-EU CAP policies, e.g. ELMS or Scottish fourth year and carbon capture / credits?
Well, I did answer and said it was a good question, but I didn't know the answer to it. It could be, I don't know. I mean, I don't know any of the consultants. Maybe no. Was like, am I throwing you the wrong thing?
Being honest, I think it's all kind of open for. It's kind of, there's so many possibilities at the moment. It's kind of hard to nail for sure which way it's going to go. But yeah, that would be my perspective on it. Yeah, and then I suppose the one other question was that someone said that there was, Robin had said that there was no difference in tillering, and that Kirsten had said there was a difference, which Robin kindly answered again. So I'm going to meanly make him read that one too.
Yeah, I mean, the farms that we'd been out to, you know, the network farms the previous couple of years, and also the experiments that we've done at Graveston, we didn't really see any major difference in terms of tillering. You know, as I said before, sometimes, you know, sometimes the grazed part of the field was a little bit more tillering, other times it wasn't a big jump, but it may be more linked to maybe when the grazing takes place. You know, Scott was saying going in early and drilling early, and then grazing earlier, that might actually stimulate tillering. I don't know. I mean, Kirsten's nodding her head there. Whereas the most of the things that certainly on our plot trials, they were grazed quite late. You know, it was into March, and they hadn't, you know, they'd only been sown probably late September, early October time, most of them. So they were, you know, they were in sort of more sort of typical, drilled at more sort of typical time of year, and so it could be something to do with that. And again, seed rates and things like that will probably have a bit of an impact as well. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that.
Yeah, Robin. So quite often, just like Scott said, to be honest, people will try it and then see the benefits, and then take their drilling back kind of 2-3 weeks, just like Scott was saying, get drilled earlier into August, and then yeah, it's got that longer recovery time, and those folk are tending to find that it's tillering more. But like you say, if they're grazed February, March, that they'll just fly through the growth stages, won't they? They don't have the same time to do it. So yeah, more in the early crops.
Thank you. And I suppose this might be the final question. Would this type of grazing be beneficial for spring barley type crops?
I don't know, to be honest. It's not something I would necessarily do, but I suppose you could do. I mean, I don't know if anybody else has got any thoughts on that one.
I think sometimes there's the worry that because the spring crops go through the growth stages so quickly that there is the potential of damaging
the growing point. Yeah,
I think that would be the main worry when it comes to the spring grazing spring cereals. But
the other thing with spring is it usually coincides when it's kind of tillering, it coincides with when there's a lot of grass, so it's actually harder to have the amount of sheep to graze it. But like you're saying, yeah, it goes through the growth stages that much faster. Whereas your winter crop, it fills in that forage gap nicely for the sheep when there's not the grass growth there, and it's slower growing as well. So that's why it's traditionally more so it's winter crop over the spring crop.
And also, if we were doing spring barley, the sheep, you could fence the whole field and they might only get kind of 3-4 days at it, and you need to move them on. I know if you have stressed a spring barley crop and it's trying to tiller, it could throw another tiller, and then it could potentially give you screenings or a mixed crop. But I was actually nearly going to ask Ian Wilson if he'd tried, because with all the talk and what the maltsters are wanting from these carbon audits and to reduce their sustainability, it would be definitely worth a try. I think if it did a 5 acres or something, I've got nothing much to lose. But I think it would be quite a lot of work to set up, and I think you need to move the sheep off quite quickly. And as you say, Kirsten, the shepherds and that could be busy getting ready for lambing, and the grass would be ready.
Yeah.
But it's definitely worth a try. You wouldn't know until you try it.
Perfect, thank you. And I suppose a quick one for you, Robin, as a bit of a fun one. How many times did for Scott, how many times did the sheep get out on you, Scott?
Sorry, what was that?
How many times did the sheep get out on you, or did they stay in place?
No, they actually stayed in place. We've had them on the stubbles before, and they've been out all the time. It was interesting. There was a grass margin at the top of the field, and when they came to the top section, they weren't interested in the grass. They were interested in the wheat. So no, that was interesting. One thing I was wondering was, like when they were on the middle section, we grazed it really hard, and there was next to nothing, and then we moved into the top, and there was quite a lot to eat. And Kirsten, can a sheep do any harm to itself if it suddenly gets to eat a lot of lush stuff if it's been struggling for something? Is that,
I would doubt they would have been struggling for forage, to be honest, because your aim is to get the leaf down, isn't it?
yeah,
So they're always going to have leaf in front of them. You're not leaving them when it is just black. And they are quite selective in that if it's really dirty, they won't eat it. But similarly, if you get, say you get a bad couple of days of wet, the barley or whatever, or wheat or whatever, it will stick to the ground and then it'll come back up again. Also, if there's a bit of an end rig there, they can go and have a chew in there. So I don't think you would have ever had them that they had nothing in front of them.
no, not at all.
That would then be your problem if you went from nothing to that. But you would have always had something there.
Mhm.
There would have always been some kind of green forage for them.
Perfect. And that's all the questions answered, and they were great questions. Thank you for putting those in. So thank you for listening to the webinar today. It has been recorded, so we will be circulating that, and we will be circulating the 2 guide documents as well. So keep an eye out for them. Okay, thank you so much.